Yeah, thank you everyone for being here today. Thanks for joining us. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Mark. I'm a lifestyle financial planner, and I typically work with women in finance, helping them identify, achieve, and maintain the lifestyle that they want without the fear of running out of money. Personally, I'm married to my beautiful wife, Nicole. I'm a father to my two amazing kids, Luke and Sephora. And my family really is my purpose. They're the reason that I do what I do, and we are on our journey to building our best lives together. And I feel really blessed that I get to do this work for my clients, helping them to build the best life that they possibly can build with the resources that they've got. This morning, we've got Rudi van der Merwe. He's our guest today. Professionally, Rudi is a CFA charter holder, amongst many other designations, Rudi. There's a long list that you've acquired over your career. Rudi is currently a portfolio manager and franchise principal at AdviceWorks Western Cape. He joined, I think it was in 2014 or 2017, Rudi? I think, yeah.
2017, yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Prior to that, you spent close to 20 years at Standard Bank stockbroking, with your last role there being Chief Investment Officer. Rudi's also a regular market commentator, both locally and internationally, frequently on the Money Show with Bruce Woodfield. And then personally, Rudi, the father to three children of varying ages and stages in life, high school, varsity, and one in corporate. So clearly, Rudi enjoys being a parent for a long period of time. Yeah, and when he's not consumed by his children's lives, he enjoys cycling. He often jokes that it may not look like it, but I guess that's the beauty of cycling, Rudi. Anybody can do it. As long as you got a bike, you can go.
That's it.
And yeah, in your spare time, you mentioned you enjoy reading. And I'm super intrigued by what you're currently reading, Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. So you're gonna have to give us some insight into that when you're done. Yeah, it may take a long time to read and then to give us a book review on it, but good luck with that.
Thank you.
Just some quick housekeeping. So webinars, as usual, very informal. We welcome all questions, which you can send through in the Q&A. Keep the chat function for chat, really. Marcus will watch that for us. We'll address questions during the presentation and at the end, if necessary. I normally say this is not going to be a death by PowerPoint presentation, but today we do have a few slides which we want to bring up just for dramatic effect, as in when it's suitable. So it's not your typical PowerPoint, but there will be a couple slides. We'll try to keep the conversation to 45 minutes and finish promptly at 11, just to respect and honor your time. So before we get going, we thought we always kick it off with a poll question. So, we assume everyone here is part of a share incentive award scheme. So the question is, how do you currently utilize your share incentive scheme awards? Do you use them to fund your annual holidays? Do you use it to fund your kids' education? Is it part of your retirement savings? Or do you use it to fund your living costs? These options typically resonate back with the planning that we do. And you'll see, the theme of today's conversation is how you can utilize these from a planning perspective, but then also the work that Rudi does from a share portfolio perspective in terms of diversification and those sorts of things. Let's just give it a couple seconds left on the poll. And then, we can share those once we've got it. Okay, so retirement savings coming out the winner, and to fund your living costs. Retirement savings makes sense. Living costs we need to have a chat about, right? From a planning perspective. But yeah, it's interesting to gauge the views. So I think maybe to start, Rudy, we can just chat around, quick overview exactly, what share incentive awards are, what shape and form they come in, and the conditions tied to it, right? So, in my experience, we kind of see them in two forms. So it's obviously part of your remuneration at your employer, and typically working in banks, we will reference the banks, right? So they either, it comes in a cash deferral, so your bonuses, your cash portion of your bonuses over a certain amount, and you get some of it in cash, and the rest is paid to you, that value in shares, but then it's got vesting dates in different tranches. That's the first, and I think those are typically unconditional in my experience. The only condition that you need to be employed for them to vest. But then the other, which is really what we're going to speak to today, is the deferred shares, which are in actually the share incentive awards. So it's part of your remuneration is receiving shares in the organization for a set amount, and they vest in different tranches, typically 3 years on specific dates. But I think the key thing here is that they're linked to the performance of your employer, right? That's kind of the catch, if you will, right? So if the company does well, you do well. Then there's another portion which I've seen at some of the other banks, where it's not just linked to the share price, but it's awarded at the share price, and then it's linked to the actual performance of the group. So not only what the share movement does, but it's what has the group done. So has the group been profitable? And there's a whole bunch of variables, and I think those variables really highlight the aspect of risk. So some people mentioned they use it to fund their living costs, and so if you're using these to fund your living costs, and the probability of it paying out is not only linked to the share price, but it's also linked to how well your employer does based on certain criteria, which is out of your control. Now you've brought in another element of risk into your planning and your portfolio. Rudy, in your years at the bank, what is your view kind of been? What have you seen in this space?
Yeah, as you've mentioned, there's various formats of this. A lot of and it takes time actually for that wealth to accumulate. So people do need to be patient, because it tends to, after 1 year, a small piece vests, and after 2 years, a smaller piece. So in the beginning, it doesn't seem like a material piece of people's wealth, and so they often, it's initially almost disregarded, because the amounts that they can get access to are rather small, and it's quite tempting if you can get, I don't know, call it half a month's salary, or a month's salary is what the value that accrues to then go and consume it. In terms of a holiday or something like that, because it doesn't look material. But I've seen the people that that are more patient with it, it can become a very material piece of the wealth. Obviously, it depends on how extended your career is, and where you find yourself in the organization. But it does become sometimes a very material piece of people's wealth, and you often find that at the end of those that didn't consume it, at the end of their careers, they all of a sudden realize, oh, okay, well, I'm now in a position that I didn't expect, where I've got this single asset exposed to a single company that makes up 40% of my total wealth. It's bigger than my pension fund, as it turned out, or was it the right place at the right time? And now what do I do with it? There's tax consequences of doing something with it. But they also often feel quite a significant loyalty to the company, so they don't necessarily want to go and exit it. And they don't, and they're scared of the tax consequences, and sometimes it's an unknown, and that in some situations, if all goes well, can turn out absolutely fine for people. But it doesn't always happen. They sometimes have goals that do not fit with having so much as a startup in a single place, and it can go wrong quite materially for people as well. Having such a big wealth startup, wealth startup. And that means also that some of the goals that you might have, just aren't realistic if you keep it all tied up in. So we've had over the years, and this it's not just linked to the banks only. Obviously, we looked after a lot of people from other industries who had similar issues, and there are lots of ways to reduce that exposure or to manage that exposure into the rest of your life. It doesn't have to be an all or nothing, like I have to exit all of this or keep all of it. There's a whole lot of ways that we can manage one's exposure over time into both towards meeting your goals and reducing your risk in a rational manner.
So before we get into those options, I just want to, you touched on a few things. There's the space where it seems insignificant, and you when they vest, you kind of you've got options when they vest, right? Maybe let's start there. So you can sell all the shares and receive the cash, or you can sell sufficient shares to cover the tax, which we'll chat about quickly now. Or you could pay the tax out of your own pockets and receive all the shares. So I think in the first example, where you sell all the shares and receive the cash, that's kind of what you're talking about when if you get a month's paycheck or 2 months paycheck. Basically it becomes a nice thing to have, right? And I think it's the start of potentially a bad cycle, right? So because now you're forming a habit in terms of how you utilize these incentives in your planning. So it's just viewed as cash, and cash typically just gets consumed. The other option is selling sufficient shares to cover the tax, and the tax implication here is, and sometimes people forget this, they see it as shares, but the tax position is that it's treated as income when it's awarded to you. So when it vests, you're liable for income tax on that. Most instances it's up to 40 or 45% against that award. So if you've got R1 million that vests, 450,000 of that is going to SARS and not the CGT, which is obviously at a lot lesser rate. So that's what a lot of people do is they sell sufficient shares to cover the tax, and that's when they start accumulating, right? So it seems insignificant depending how early on you get into this level in your career and how that growth kind of happens, but then they just start accumulating, and now again you formed a habit of selling to cover and just building up this one asset, this one single stock in the asset, which accumulates over time. And then if you do nothing apart from all the risks, at the end of the day you potentially sit with a tax consequence that you weren't really aware of. As they vest into your name, that becomes the base cost as of that date. So whatever that value of those shares are at that date, that's the base cost. And if you hold these things for prolonged periods of time, it's obviously hopefully they go up. The CGT at that point in time could be quite significant. So I think what is, you touched on it, Rudi, but like what is the problem with doing nothing, right? Like selling to cover. What is the issue with that?
No, there isn't any. I don't think. I think selling to cover just the tax portion is a reasonably rational way to do it. I think the temptation is always going to be to how does one manage it, because you have to take a view on the company at the time, and that's not always easy to get right at the times that you are allowed to sell those shares. Obviously, but I think it does make one of the attractions of doing that selling to cover is then you actually get the shares in your name and you can put them in your portfolio. And that's normally it's very often at the bank that
online share
trading working for. Yeah, so you end up getting whatever it is, 500 or 1,000 shares in your account. The attraction of that is that you then start earning dividends on them, which you don't typically do.
Okay.
Don't have access to dividends. So you do have some cash flow, and then you have. I think once it's in a portfolio like that, then it is regarded as savings. People don't easily then, as easily go and
sell the shares,
dissolve it, and
realize the capital.
Consume it, yeah. So that I think is the rational way to do it, is to basically pay the tax as it goes. Tax rates, as we know, tend to creep over time, but at least you get some tax certainty as to the rate that you're paying now, and then you can start accumulating, and then you've got optionality as well. You've got, once they're in your name, they're part of your portfolio. Then whenever you need that, you can access it either by selling it or moving it into a portfolio or diversifying it, or you don't have to wait for a specific period of time and go through an administrative process to access that capital should you need access to it.
Really, I just want to stop you there quickly. You said something which I've never thought of, but it is quite a big assumption that we're making when people sell to cover and hold the asset. You said as if they are taking a view on the company and the long-term performance thereof. I don't think that necessarily happens, to be honest. I think when somebody receives these shares, it's my bonus, right? That's what it is. It's what I'm entitled to. We're not looking at it through the lens of, okay, I've received an asset, I've received a share. What is the long-term outlook for the share? You know, would I necessarily buy this myself? And I think that's a very different lens that's being applied to this, as if it's given to you versus if you went out and bought it.
Yeah, I didn't think about it that way. My perspective always obviously is to regard these shares as an asset. It's asset. What are the returns that can generate over time? How much dividends can it pay me? What is the growth likely that I can receive from it? And as soon as, I suppose that's a bridge that people need to cross. As soon as you think of it along those lines, then you're starting to think, well, are there alternative assets that I would rather hold? And if so, why? So it doesn't mean that you have to sort of feel like you're being insincere to the company you work for because you're selling now Standard Bank to buy Absa shares. That doesn't have to be the case, but you might want to buy Microsoft or or something else that is a totally different industry or in a different jurisdiction, and a whole different industry segment where you think you can get better growth and reduce your exposure to the company. So absolutely, yeah, I think that one does need to regard it as an asset and not part of your remuneration. And as soon as you start doing that, then it leads you to start regarding it as part of your long-term planning, your long-term savings, I would have thought.
Yeah, so I think that there's two elements there. Again, it's the thought process of regarding it as a long-term asset, and how does that asset fit into your overall plan, which, typically I don't think people look at it from that perspective. So from a planning, we like to look at it and say, okay, great, how do we include this into your plan? So, we touched on a few of those things. Initially, are you going to use it to fund your holidays? Are you going to use it to fund your kids' education? Is it part of your retirement? Or are you going to live off of it, right? So there's pros and cons of all of those. But there's a planning element. And then there's the other element of bringing somebody like you into it, who's going to look at it from the perspective of, what does the dividends look like? What's the long-term growth expectations? What's the fundamentals of the company? That lens, I think the normal person doesn't really apply, right? So it kind of just highlights that need there. And why? So when I said what could go wrong, right? So let's say you don't do that. Let's just say you're in this thing and you keep sort of accumulating these single stocks through your employer. Like, what can go wrong?
So when the primary way that we look at reducing risk is by diversifying risk. So and that means the problem with it is that a big chunk of your capital now is tied up in one place, and it's also this place that you work. So you've got massive concentration of exposure of your life that's connected to one specific company. That isn't always a problem, and in fact, for most people, most of the time, it isn't a problem. A lot of old Standard Bank directors that I looked after actually just maintained this as a massive piece of their wealth, and they lived off the dividends very often. The dividends are very attractive income and are a very tax-friendly way to receive income. So for a lot of those people, it actually worked out very well so far. The risk is that when it doesn't work out well, and we've seen a number of occasions where that happens, and when things do go wrong, they often go wrong not because of the person who received the shares. You're not involved in why things go wrong. You don't always know that things are going to go wrong, but things can go wrong quite suddenly. And when that happens, it can be very unpleasant and have very material consequences for people. So, as I said, we think of the primary way to reduce risk is to diversify. That means not having all your eggs in one basket, so spreading your risk amongst a number of investments, which means, and the whole point of diversification is that if something goes catastrophically wrong with one of the things that you own, it doesn't impact everything that you own. So it doesn't impact your whole asset base very, very materially. And there's a point beyond which diversification doesn't make sense, just to touch on that for what it's worth. So typically, mathematically, beyond sort of, if you just talk about a share portfolio, if you have one investment, obviously if that investment crashes, 100% of your life is at stake. But typically, if you spread it between sort of 12 stocks or more, then beyond 12, the additional risk reduction that you get for spreading it further is reasonably mathematically insignificant. But so just to touch on what can go wrong, I'm actually going to share a screen here quickly with you. If we can give me a second.
Got it, Jeff. You want to? Which one are you referring to?
Yeah, so if you've got it there, that'll be great. Just the first slide on Steinhoff, if you don't mind.
Yes. This one here.
That's it, yeah. So, I mean, this is we all know the Steinhoff story and Marcus Jooste and how catastrophically that went wrong. So, there are a lot of people that worked for Steinhoff for their entire careers, you know, and had no idea of what was happening here. And they were quite generous with their share options and then made it very, it was a frowned upon thing for people who wanted to sell them. You know, it was seen as disloyalty and the like. So, people sort of felt beholden to hold on to those shares. And the share price sort of started drifting lower over a period of time, and there were lots of talk about, oh, there's investigations in Europe regarding potential tax issues and so forth. So it did drift low a little bit, but there was a lot of denial from senior management and a lot of analysts in the market, actually. If you were watching financial TV or the newspapers and the like, there were a lot of people that are supporting it, saying this is nonsense. So you could easily have been tempted into just hanging onto those shares, and a lot of people did, until one morning they woke up to an announcement that Marcus Jooste had resigned and apologized for what had gotten wrong, and that's obviously where this catastrophic collapse began, and then the share immediately lost pretty much the bulk of its value. This is a log graph, so it went from 60 to 40 very, very quickly, and then drifted from there, over a painful period with short little bursts of rallies. But effectively, where the share price is now, people would have lost 98% of their value. So just to put it in perspective, a year before that crash, the dividends that you would have gotten on the company would probably be 3 times what the value of the assets were that you held after the crash.
Wow.
So it turned literally, for all intents and purposes, into nothing. And it wasn't only for the company shareholders, a lot of other people got hurt by that. People who sold their businesses into that. So Chris Wiese, who's probably the most astute investor in South Africa, and at the time was the wealthiest person in South Africa, lost a massive chunk of his wealth because he put Pepkor into there. And he was very, very fortunate not to have gotten sucked into selling Shoprite into that as well. If it wasn't for Whitey Bosom, he might have lost several more billion by putting Shoprite into Steinhoff. Other people were in a similar situation. The people that sold Tikkie Town, also who were entrepreneurs, they went and built a business through hell of a hard work and very good entrepreneurial skills and development, and they lost, I think, 1.7 billion rand, and are fighting it, but are going to be hard pressed to recover that money. So that can happen very, very quickly, and if the bulk of your wealth is tied up in a company, it is catastrophic. A lot of those people will never recover from that pain. The problem with it as well is that you very often, as a shareholder or as an insider, are not allowed to sell in a period like that. So as an outside shareholder, you can still go and choose to tie up all your money in a company if you want to take that sort of risk. But as a company employee, when something like that does go wrong, you're very often in a closed period because there's no announcement. Oh, we're not going to, we're going to delay our financial results until we've sorted this out. And there you go. That's it. You're stuck. You can't sell. You don't have an option anymore to get out. So you then become consumed by the experience, unfortunately. So this is Steinhoff. One can say, people they should have read the writing on the wall, but it doesn't only happen to the Steinhoffs. We saw a similar situation in South Africa with African Bank,
Just
which
before you move on there, Rudi, I just want to highlight the point that you're talking from an investor perspective, right? So investors could have seen it, should have, people got sucked into, Marcus Jooster's story. But, we're coming from the aspect of employees, right? So these are people who have worked there for, 10, 20 years. That for them, this is just what they know, right? It's the place they show up every day. This is how they get remunerated. They don't really have this kind of insight into what's going on. Well, you would think so operationally, but what was going on in this specific story, nobody had insight into. So, they're not analyzing the actual stock that they've received. They're just taking it on as part of their remuneration package. And when a drop like this happens, you can't recover, from that wipes out that entire nest egg that you've been building.
Absolutely, and you're quite right. People inside would not typically be able to see that. I think there might have been a handful of people who knew some of the rot, but the guy that, as you say, rocks up there every day, he sells couches, and the couches are going out the door and they're being manufactured. He sees the trucks are moving. He doesn't know there's a massive hole in the balance sheet in Europe somewhere, where they've hidden losses and the like. There's no way for and even the analysts that were analyzing it, there were very, very few of them that had a vague idea of how bad the errors actually were. So absolutely, this would hit you out of the blue. You wouldn't have an idea. Even the people in the company, as I say, that look very carefully at the financials, probably wouldn't have picked up that there was a problem. So no, it comes out of the blue and very, very quickly.
You were speaking of Lehman Brothers, and this, if I'm not mistaken, this is kind of what spurred on the financial crisis, right? This was the start of that. So
and then that sort of 2008 period. So this was the canary in the mine, essentially. So they didn't cause the problem, but they were a very early victim of it. I don't think we have the time or the sort of prerogative to go into the details of what did cause it, but effectively, Lehman Brothers was a massive, massive bank. It was the fourth largest investment bank in the US and had 25,000 employees, about 150 years old. I think it was started in the 1850s, had assets over $600 billion. So it was one of those too big to fail companies. In fact, that's part of what got the freeze up of the financial system going during that crash. Is that Lehman Brothers came under this massive pressure, and that was also, people were tied into Lehman very, very materially, and in fact, even people who were close to them in the industry, Lehman had a lot of cross loans from other banks, and so their balance sheets were closely correlated with each other. Goldman Sachs almost went under as a result of the collapse of Lehman Brothers. If it wasn't for Warren Buffett coming and bailing them out, they would have been gone too, including a lot of other really big financial banks. So this caused systemic risk in this case. Normally, when there's a systemic event, one gets some sort of help from regulatory from the regulatory side of the economy, like the central banks and treasuries and the like. But you don't always know that that's going to be the case. And again, same sort of message I think is true if you had your life savings tied up in Lehman Brothers stock, which was a very material company, probably bigger than the South African banks together. Then you would have lost a lot.
If we look at this line that you put at the bottom here, thinking of it from an employee's perspective, right? So I work for a bank that's been around for 150 years. It's the fourth largest investment bank in the US. We've got assets over 600 billion. That poses no risk to me, right? On the surface, I'm loyal. They're rewarding me well. Something like this, comes out of nowhere. It's systemic risk. It moves down. But again, you're not evaluating the stock as an investor. You're receiving it as an employee, and you touched on it earlier. It almost creates this loyalty, which I don't know where it comes from, or it's basically bought loyalty. And then something like this happens, which you don't have sight into, really.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that loyalty, I mean, well, we can all understand it. It's partly pride. You know, the people you work with are honest, honorable people. They're doing, you can see they're not trying to sort of scam the system. So when it becomes loyal to it, and you see over years that they've treated you well and treated other people well, and so that loyalty is easy to build. And every employer wants loyalty and tries to build it. It's a good thing, and I think it is good to be loyal to the business you work with. But that loyalty doesn't need to extend to stupidity.
Exactly.
So there is a point at which it becomes a risk, and you can absolutely still be loyal to the company while not having all your assets and your work life tied up in the same place at the same time.
So let's maybe bring it a little bit closer to home. And I think, the South African banks, if we look at COVID as an example, so 2020, that was quite a definitive period for what we're talking about, right? So we'd gone through, people worked, everyone had to move home, there's big adjustments, and so there's this instability in your personal life, your working life. You're working really hard, but the banks are taking strain, right? The economy is not doing well, they're taking strain. So during this period of time, you don't get a salary increase. If you're lucky, your salary stays the same. The bank's looking at cutting costs. If you're lucky, you get a reduced bonus, if you get any bonus at all, barring the fact that you've worked probably double as hard as you've had to work in a long time. But then I think this is the fall sort of over here, right?
That is, yeah. So maybe I should just touch on what else is in this graph, because it looks like a very busy picture. Yeah. So this is over a 5-year period to right now. And then just from the colors of what these are, so the blue line here is Standard Bank. The green line is actually the S&P 500 in Rand. So it's the S&P 500 index, which is an index of the 500 largest companies in the US. So this is, if one wanted to buy an exchange traded fund or that is diversified in the US, this is something one would typically want to buy. But that includes the benefit of having foreign assets. So in other words, this would have been your Rand return if you bought. So you get some Rand protection there. The red or pinkish type line, maroon, if you want to call it that, is ABSA, and the yellow is FirstRand. So this is these returns are the total returns. So that means including dividends over this period of time. And yes, as you can see, this is the COVID period here. So there was a massive drop off in the banking industry. To be fair, I mean, the S&P 500 index also came down materially. One was protected by the Rand to some extent. And I suppose that's one of the things that one can touch on from a diversification point of view, is that if one has foreign assets, very often when markets as a general come under pressure, so when financial assets come under pressure, it normally means people are wary of risk. And when people are wary of risk, they normally sell emerging market currencies as well. So they go and there's what they call a flight to quality. So a lot of people rush into what is regarded as safe haven assets, which is often dollar-based assets. And then you find that the currency weakens, so the Rand weakens, not only the Rand, but the Brazilian real and other emerging market currencies as well. So if one's holding dollar-based assets, you get a partial protection. You get a little bit of a shield because your currency weakens from that. But if you're only in SA assets, then you get the full brunt of the pain. So our banks all got sold off, and probably all by similar amounts over this period. But they took a massive smack. I think the rest of our, to be fair, the rest of your domestic listed companies probably also came under a lot of pressure during that period. So it wasn't a banking specific thing. But you can certainly see amongst the banks that didn't help, whether you had FirstRand or Standard Bank, or had two banks in your portfolio only. Having been exposed to only one industry, you would have gotten the same result. You got hammered. So it was really an unpleasant period. The banks certainly have recovered since then and are at the moment producing very nice results. But just over time, this is also to as the indication. So when do you diversify? Do you wait until the end of your career, when you leave there, to start thinking about, okay, now I must diversify, because you get the benefits of diversification right up front, so you can wear that risk for all those periods and then decide to do it right at the end of your life and to avoid future risk, or you can do it as you go. And as you can see, this is not necessarily a fair comparison, because we're comparing offshore assets, domestic assets. But I think a lot of us, being South Africans, are naturally under-invested in foreign markets or in foreign assets, and that's partly a diversification thing. It makes sense to not have all your assets in one country. South Africa makes up probably 0.5% of global GDP, so it doesn't make sense to have all your assets here. Not all the good ideas can possibly come from here. There must be good ideas elsewhere as well. So it's reducing risk. One needs to have some foreign assets, and there's opportunities offshore that we just can't access from an industry perspective. Some technology, some healthcare, and others. So it does make sense to have a portion of one's assets there, and this just gives you an indication of what would have happened. Even though our banks have done fairly well, but over a 5-year period, we would have been materially better off having, even if it's just a portion of your assets.
Yeah, I think before we move to the longer period, I think the key here is, I remember having conversations with clients during this period where they, you're under a lot of stress. You're dealing with a lot of change. Your kids are at home. You're homeschooling. You're working from home. So you're putting in a lot of efforts. Then you don't get an increase. You don't get a bonus. Plus, this equity portfolio that you've grown through your remuneration scheme is now worth, I think in Standard Bank's case, it was about 50% less. It went from 200 to 90 odd rand. And yes, you don't realize that until you sell it, but emotionally you're getting battered, right? You're getting hit, you're getting hurt, and that emotion tends to make people want to do things. It's like, well, now is the time I need to manage my risk. So people are making rash decisions down in this period here, where we can all see it with hindsight. If you had just held on, for another year, you would have been okay, and held on further, you would have been okay. But we don't have hindsight, so it's, I think what we're trying to say is, number one, where does it fit into your portfolio in terms of your overall planning, consumption, or wealth creation, or education? And if it's any of those things, would you ordinarily use a single stock to achieve that? Or, like you've shown here, do you look at some form of diversification? And as we move over sort of a 5-year period, what is this? This is I think this is a 10-year period.
10-year period, yeah.
Things in the way there. So yeah, a 10-year period.
Yes.
This sort of story that the picture you're painting just, elaborates itself.
Yes, it gets bigger basically. I mean, the reasons for the diversification increase the longer the time is, and part of the thing with diversification is it allows you the luxury of not having to make crisis decisions. So it makes you able to plan for risk and manage risk ahead of time rather than react to risk when it happens. So if you do it up front and you've got access to not only different companies, but different industries and different assets, hopefully. We've got some cash, some fixed interest, some property, some whatever the case may be in that blend, because sometimes you find that specific industries have a very high correlation when things go wrong. So as you can see in the banking sector, when things go wrong, they all react in the same direction very materially. So yeah, planning for it up front means you don't have to, as you say, yeah, I've just gotten hit, I'm working from home, and now I have to make a decision on my assets when they've dropped 60% of their value, and then I make a bad decision. I open myself up to whiplash and the like, rather than saying beforehand, well, this is the way I'm going to manage my risk. I'm not going to put it. I'm going to make sure that if there's a catastrophic failure in the company I work for, not all of my assets are tied up at the same time. So, but you can do that beforehand. You can't. At the time, you're almost certain to make a poor decision.
Yeah, and I think we're not saying you're going to completely insulate yourself, because you can see here in your example, there's still pain, but it's not nearly as deep and long as a single stock would fall if it gets hurt. And I think we can just call it a single stock. It doesn't matter that it's a bank. It's just a single stock. If that sector goes down, it's going to fall very hard and take a longer time to recover, if it does recover. And then this is 10 years. Well, this is...
Yes, so the two graphs are just 5 years and 10 years.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the compounding impact that you get as well from risk reduction. That's the same as you get growth compounding, you get the compounding impact of not making mistakes. And so part of, I know what you guys do when you do the planning for clients, is talk them through the process of, there's a period in your life that you go through where you generate more cash flow than you consume, and the excess you can save. And you can decide for yourself. You influence how much of that excess you save. So that's one of the early levers you can pull to determine what your lifestyle is going to be one day when you retire, is how much of what I generate do I save. And the next one is, how do I invest that money? So that's not only how much growth you can generate out of that money, but how much you can avoid catastrophes with the money that you are saving. So if you can grow your money better than the next guy, well, you've got a bigger honeypot when you start consuming your assets. But also, if you can avoid major catastrophe, you don't get burnt as much when things go wrong, and things do go wrong. And any one of us just needs to look around the room. The world is a mess. There's lots of potential for things to go wrong all over the place, and so we need to plan to allow for things to go wrong, and if you can avoid some of the major catastrophes that happen, or even reduce them, participate in to a smaller amount, that means that the amount of compounding that you get out of your growth over time is better. So you accumulate a bigger nest egg, and hopefully that translates to a better lifestyle when you do need to consume those assets.
Yeah, I think from our perspective, we want to bring it into your planning in terms of how are you going to use these assets? So, what is the goal? What is the need? We then relay that back to you in terms of a return objective. You put an asset allocation together, which is diversified. Just saying asset allocation, there's diversification within that, and then there's diversification within the equity building block, and that's together over time. Like you say, it kind of insulates you from when things go wrong, because things will go wrong. Things do go wrong. We're in a market now where things have been going wrong this whole year. Initially, we just thought it was going to be inflation. Now it's inflation, Ukraine, Russia, it's all of these things. And with hindsight, it makes sense, but we don't know, right, what's going to happen. And also, you don't know when these things are going to happen in relation to your life cycle. So when you're going to go on retirement, when your kids need to go to university, so the way to kind of protect, in a sense, is through that diversification, and maybe starting earlier. When we were chatting earlier, you mentioned different approaches to it. So you don't necessarily have to sell everything. You use a term almost like you're using a checkbook type of thing. Do you want to maybe just elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, yes. So where one has accumulated an asset or a holding in one company like this, it doesn't have to be a one decision. Okay, I'm selling all of it and I'm diversifying right now. So that's a process that can be managed. It can be managed. There's often tax consequences of selling it. So you might have a CGT consequence. So you don't necessarily want to sell it all at once. A lot of people, as we've mentioned as well, have an emotional type of company. You can still maintain a reasonable holding in that business. You don't have to exit all of it. And one can manage the process at which you do it. So you can either say, well, I'm going to do 10% a year over the next 10 years, 30% a year over the next 10 years, or I'm going to do an initial lump sum amount just to start a portfolio. So maybe I need to start a diversified portfolio, maybe I need R1 million of the capital. So I'll sell R1 million of my nest egg in this company. And then over time, I'll reduce it by more up to a specific point. What we often also do is to use it almost as a checkbook. So we'll take a portion and start a portfolio for somebody, and then when there's an attractive opportunity elsewhere, so maybe there's a the rand becomes very, very strong, and maybe it's a good time, we think, to take some money offshore and say, okay, well, let's raise some cash to move some money offshore and start a portfolio there as well. Or there's an opportunity in a specific company, whatever it may be, that's self-sufficient of your current holding to just get a entry level into this other company, which is really offering value at the moment. So one can really do it over a period of time, and it's very easy to manage that either to a specific schedule or to opportunistically diversify over time. But at least then one has, once you've got a plan in place, you can start implementing them. None of that ever has to be set in stone. You can change it if the outlook for the business that you work for changes very materially. Either for the worse, you can accelerate your exit, or if it changes for the better, maybe they buy some or invent some phenomenal technology which makes them very difficult to compete with, and you hang on, you delay your action of exposure.
Yeah.
So that's definitely, it's a process that one, but I think one just needs to get your head around.
I think that's it.
That it makes sense.
It's about identifying the role that it currently plays and that it can play, because also the nature of these things is almost, provided nothing goes drastically wrong in your career, as in when you get into this cycle where you start to receive these shares, it almost becomes an annual thing, barring like a COVID event or something like that. It happens annually, and they vest in tranches. And if you stay with that employer, it becomes like a snowball effect. So every year you've got, if you're in your third year, you've got 3 years prior, different tranches vesting. So the snowball keeps going. So while you're diversifying on the one end, you're still accumulating on the other end. And I think the message is really have a plan in terms of what you can do with it, but also have a plan in how you're going to execute it, so that when the share price falls 50%, there's a plan in place. You don't need to do anything. You don't need a knee-jerk reaction. It doesn't, an emotional sell or an emotional buy. Over the next 12 months, this is what we've got. This is how we're going to execute it. And it's sitting in a place where you're able to move on it. So it's there, it's accessible. You can trade it, you can put it in cash, or you can buy the other opportunity along the way.
100%. I think that's important to put that plan in place. And one also gets some certainty on, so if you decide to reduce, for example, if the CGT built up and you decide to reduce portion of your holding now, at least you've got tax certainty as well. You're not exposing yourself to uncertainty of how do these tax rates change into the future. I know now I'll pay an effective 18% tax rate on CGT, so but that might be 25% in a year's time. At some stage, these rates are going to get pressure to go out, there's no doubt.
Yeah, and I think doing it like this also gives you opportunity, from an overall planning perspective, estate planning, tax planning, to potentially put these in tax efficient vehicles that they aren't initially, right? So using a local endowment, an offshore endowment versus a direct holding, that reduces and minimizes estate duty taxes, but also it ensures continuity in your planning in terms of who's meant to inherit or benefit. Does it come back to your estate? Are you liable for taxes overseas? You can deal with all of those things upfront, knowing what's going to happen, as opposed to leaving it to chance at a later stage in time.
100%, yes. As you mentioned, I think that endowment example is a very, very important one. I know a lot of the investments that one makes, you want to put in some sort of structure for a continuity perspective. And some people like to use trusts, and there's benefits and pitfalls in that. But if one uses a structure of some sort, and specifically offshore, it makes a lot of sense for estate planning purposes and CITES taxes and so on. And you can get that the actual growth can take place within that structure rather than in your own name. And that structure's tax, the consequences from a tax perspective are very different to being taxed in your own name. So it absolutely makes sense to plan.
And again, doing this initially is easier to get your head around, because it's a potentially a smaller tax implication here. Whereas if you accumulate the single stock up until retirement, for instance, which is now, you said in some instances potentially bigger than your pension fund. It becomes a very hard decision at that point in time to take the tax knock. The tax is the tax, but to make a decision then to go and sell and incur the CGT, emotionally, it's hard to do that. You don't want to pay away a third of what you've accumulated now, because diversification now, it's like this emotional game that you play with yourself. It's the right thing to do, but you don't want to pay the tax now. Whereas if you just get into the habit of doing it annually, you're still going to pay the tax. It's just going to feel like a lot less tax, and it's also pegged.
That's also not good. Yeah. So if one waits till it's one big pot, it's one price point that you're exposing yourself to, one event. So, which again increases the risk of you getting it wrong. That might be the wrong time to sell that company. If you do it over a period of time, so over 20 years, every year you sell whatever it is, 50% of what it is that you got access to. Then you've got 20 different occasions which you went and you diversified and you bought into different companies in different stages. So your chances of benefiting from diversification and getting growth is quite good. Now, if you go and do it once off, you go and sell, at retirement after working for a place for 40 years at one price point on out, the chances of getting it wrong because you've only had one chance to do it is much higher. That the next year might be a fantastic one for that company that you're working for, and a poor one for the rest of the market. Then you've got all the emotional distress that goes with that. So,
yeah,
it seems to manage up.
We're 5 minutes to go. I'm not sure if there's any questions. We haven't really come up with any. If there are any, you can shoot them across. I think maybe just in closing, I'll address any questions if they come up. But really, it's been really informative, and I think it just speaks to kind of the work that we do in terms of partnering, but also in terms of planning, right? So it's key to take a view on the role that these awards play in your life now, but the role that they're likely to play into the future, and putting something in place, right? So figuring out where in your life it makes sense, how best to use it, and then we partner with someone like you to take away the emotional side for us, right? So it's the single stock. I don't know who used this example, but it's owning the single stock in your company. If we sat down and said, okay, Mr. Client, Mrs. Client, our recommendation is for you to buy this one share for the rest of your life, would you do it? You would look at us and say, are you guys mad? So by partnering with you remove that, and are able to kind of build out a diversified portfolio, which we can then manage over time to achieve the things you want to achieve. But just another thing that made a lot of sense to me, like you said, we assume that you're taking a view on this company when you receive the shares. And I don't think a lot of people do that. I think they just receive it and accumulate and let it roll. But anything lastly from your side, Rudi?
No, I think what you said makes sense. I think the reiterating this planning process that you go through is very important. And annually to review that. Okay, well, what's changed in my life? What's changed in the world? How does that influence where this is all heading? But to not take a short-term view on what's essentially long-term assets. It really has the potential to change the long-term outcome of your lifestyle planning if you sort of just view it correctly upfront.
Right, great. Really, thank you so much. I appreciate your insight and experience in this regard. And yeah, from our side, I just want to resonate the planning aspect, or reiterate, sorry, the planning aspect and how to just be aware of what you can do with these things. I think the power of creating real long-term wealth through an incentive like this is really huge. So yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to be here today. You can reach out to Rudi or myself if this is of interest to you, and we'll assist where we can. Thank you so much. Thanks, Rudi.
Thank you.